History of oil. In the ancient times, crude oil has a long history of use. It is estimated that people started using oil since 4000 BC. Pennsylvania, 1859. Modern oil era begins. Beginning of modern oil era. In the 1840s, a businessman and a salt mine owner named Samuel Keir noticed that some of his works and salt wells were becoming stained with oil. Initially, he dumped the substance as he thought it was useless. However, he noticed that some local Senecan Indians were using the oil for medicinal purposes and thought it could be a clever idea to commercialize the oil. Pennsylvania, 1859. Modern oil era begins. Modern oil era will change the way we run our lives. On August 27, 1859, the Drake well struck oil at 69.5 feet, and with it began the era of an industry that changed completely the way we run our lives. The new well yielded 15 barrels a day, and word quickly spread across the region. Pennsylvania, 1859. Modern oil era begins. Oil became known as black gold. Word spread so quickly that Drake's well created a furore in the region that resembled quite likely the California gold rush of 1849. From this moment, oil became known as black gold. Standard Oil Company. John Rockefeller forms the Standard Oil Company. In 1970, Rockefeller formed the Standard Oil Company, which by 1890 controlled approximately 90% of all oil market in the US. Standard Oil Company. The Supreme Court split Standard Oil. In 1911, the Supreme Court found the company in violation of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1880 and ordered the company to be divided by 34 unrelated companies. Standard Oil Company. The barrel unit is standardized. The Standard Oil Company standardized the measure of oil which we still use nowadays. Although oil was not transported in whiskey barrels anymore, the barrel remained the default measure in the market. Modern oil era. Early 20th century. Aerospace industry adapts oil. Oil properties were also fundamental in the development of the aerospace industry. At the beginning, aeroplanes were thought useless for military purposes, but later they were adapted for reconnaissance missions and then for aerial combat. Modern oil era. Oil transforms the battlefield. World War I transformed oil into a strategic commodity central to international politics. US transportation energy sources. Fuels. Modern oil era. In reality, oil is present in our everyday life. By 1950, oil was adapted for transportation purposes, but eventually found its way into other daily life activities. Oil in our daily life. Modern oil era. Except in exceptional circumstances, oil is barely used to produce electricity. The Seven Sisters. A secret meeting is held at Achnacarry Castle. In 1928, after the world gradually recovered from the World War I, English and American companies started worrying that the world could be heading again to an overproduction and overcapacity market condition. To address the situation, the leaders of major oil companies held a secret meeting at Achnacarry Castle in the Scottish Highlands. The Seven Sisters. TRC imposes production restrictions. On September 2nd, the TRC issued a new proration order limiting production to 400,000 barrels a day, immediately taking the price from 2 cents to 85 cents per barrel. The Seven Sisters. Standard Oil Company of New Jersey, Standard Oil Company of New York, Standard Oil of California, Texas Company, Royal Dutch Shell, Anglo-Persian Oil Company, Standard Oil of Indiana, Gulf Oil. OPEC origins. Oil companies produce based on concessions. A concession is a license guaranteed by a government that gives the oil company the exclusive rights to explore and produce oil in a specific geographical area. OPEC origins. US Gulf Coast as a pricing reference. Oil majors usually agreed concessions based on a 50-50 profit sharing with the host country. The major would establish an arbitrary price to buy the crude and then split the net revenue with the country. This arbitrary price, known as the posted price, was usually determined by taking the US Gulf Coast posted price and adjusting it by the transportation costs from the country in which the production was taking place. OPEC origins. Oil-producing countries grow discontent towards the 50-50 concession. Given that the TRC was in control of all the US space capacity, it was consequently in control of the US Gulf posted prices. Further, since crude prices in other locations were linked to the US Gulf Coast via netback pricing, the TRC was in control of global prices as well. OPEC origins. The Abadan crisis. In 1951, Iran was one of the first countries to break the 50-50 concession when its Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, Britain's greatest economic asset in the Middle East. OPEC origin. 50-50 concession is broken. Enrico Mattei, president of ENI, negotiated an unprecedented deal in which Iran would get 75% of the overall profits, 50% as royalty fees and 25% as revenues, while the Italian company would earn just 25% of profits. OPEC origins. While the oil market was still being dominated by the Seven Sisters, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, was formed in Baghdad in September 1960. OPEC established its secretariat in Geneva first, and then in 1965 in Vienna. OPEC origins. At present, the organization has a total of 13 member countries. OPEC origins. The US runs out of space capacity. Without US space capacity, pricing power quickly switched hands from the TRC to the OPEC, and since there was an existing disagreement with the 50-50 concession, oil companies started negotiating the concession seriously for the first time in 1971. OPEC origins. The Yom Kippur War. The conflict, known as the Yom Kippur War, was a surprise attack against Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur. Following the outbreak of hostilities, both the United States and the Soviet Union started resupplying their allies during the war, Israel and the Arab states respectively, which led to a near confrontation between the two powers. The Arab nations were initially US allies but saw the resupply of Israel as an anti-Arab gesture. OPEC origins. Arab oil embargo rattles oil market. To support Egypt and Syria, Arab OPEC members decide to impose an embargo against the US in retaliation for its decision to resupply Israel and gain bargaining power in post-war negotiations. OPEC origins. IEA is created in response to oil crisis. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, realized they were not properly equipped to deal with the oil embargo, which pushed prices to historically elevated levels. Therefore, to effectively respond to any potential disruptions in oil supply, the OECD created the International Energy Agency, IEA, in November 1974. OPEC origins. Late 20th century, Iranian Revolution. Only 4 years after the Arab embargo, the oil market would face another oil shock in the Middle East, fueled by the expectations created by the 1973 oil revenue, the 1953 coup d'etat, and anti-American sentiment. Iranian people started escalating protests towards the Shah in 1978.